Companions, welcome. I am still talking to you about my experiences with poachers in the African wilderness. Just 15 years ago, huge areas of southern Africa were still completely untouched, or they were ostensibly conservation areas, but they were so remote that they were very poorly managed or policed. And these were the areas where I could roam at will. But as civilization, if you want to call it that, began to spread into Africa, many of these areas became hunting concessions or more formal game reserves, and some got infested with jihadist groups, and that made it unwise to walk around alone in the bush. Now, wandering around in these remote areas were of course not without risks ever. One could easily encounter some serious mishap like a breakdown of the vehicle or getting seriously injured by a dangerous animal or indeed encountering poachers. Because these hinterlands were the hunting grounds of the killer gangs. Now the killer gangs are men that live in the larger villages around the edges of the wilderness. And they would make up groups of 5, 10, 20, and they would walk into the bush for 2, 3, 4 days until they find an area that had enough wildlife in it. There, they would make a camp. Now, it's just a rudimentary affair. They just clear the area a bit. They drag up some firewood. They cut some grass to put their sleeping mats on. They sleep on the ground between fires to protect them against predators. And they put tree stumps on either side of themselves to prevent them from rolling into the fires. Then they would start hunting around the area or poaching. They would use traps and snares and an assortment of firearms. Old muzzleloaders, homemade pipe guns, worn out hunting rifles from the Portuguese times, assault rifles from the bush wars, and they would kill anything within a day or so of walking from where they camped, including me if they found me. Nobody would ever find me, A, and B, connect me to them. So they were guys to be avoided at all costs. Now, if I found signs of poachers in the bush, then one is never sure whether it was made by one of the killer gangs or by a protein poacher, which I told you about last time. Because these killer gangs, when they operate during the day, they go out in ones and twos. And you never know when you see a track whether it is from a killer gang. So if I see any sign of poachers in the area, I pack up and leave immediately. It's just too dangerous because the killer gangs can very much outgun me. These guys will hunt until they have enough loot. Then they will send the stuff back to their villages to be stored by a few of their number, while the rest of the gang carries on hunting. Once they've depleted the area, they will move to another area some distance away, and they may stay in the bush for weeks, even months. Once they think they have enough booty, they will return, and then they will start selling what they have plundered. The meat would be dried, of course, and they would sell that to local people mostly. But the skins and the valuable parts, such as perhaps the few bits of ivory and predator parts, those would find their way into bigger towns and cities of the so-called modern world. Now, I thought I would like to read you a piece from my book, The Wanderers, which I published some years ago. I called Elias over, and we went to investigate. It was a fresh chop mark made by an axe or a machete. There weren't any tracks at or around the base of the tree, but it was unmistakably human-made. The brown globules of gum that had seeped out from the white wood were still soft on the inside, so it was probably made only a few days ago. It was typical of someone wanting to mark a route or a position, perhaps to a snare or a beehive or even a kill. I looked around, and yes, there was another mark on a tree some 200 meters away. I pointed it out to Elias. He nodded, but he seemed strangely averse or disinterested. I couldn't quite place his reaction. I was intrigued by the marks, and I wondered who had made them and where they led to. So I started following them. They were easy to follow, and I moved quite quickly. After about an hour, I found some human footprints, made by someone wearing sandals that were made from old car tires. And then more footprints, along a fairly well-worn path. Elias was now getting inexplicably uncooperative, lagging behind and shaking his head every time I looked back at him. At some point, I caught a whiff of wood smoke and the hint of fried meat. We were both ravenously hungry because of our precarious food situation. We came upon a huge baobab tree, around which the vegetation had been cleared for about 15 paces. There were 3 men there, sitting on their haunches around a lazily smoking fire, eating meat from a lattice made out of saplings that were tied together with bark. They jumped up as they saw us. Their faces were ashen with fright. One hinted at running away, but he restrained himself. And as we stood uncertainly staring at each other, they gradually got over their surprise, and now their attitude turned more surly. I looked around warily. The area around the tree was trodden to powder and untidily strewn with waste and camp equipment. Sleeping mats, some spread, some rolled up, a few earthen pots of various sizes, items of clothing, animal skins, some spread out, some hanging, and lots of meat, mostly cut into long, thin strands and at various stages of drying. Leaning against the baobab trunk stood a muzzle-loading gun. On closer inspection, it turned out to be homemade, with a water pipe for a barrel. It was crude, but it was probably deadly at close quarters. It suddenly became clear to me. This was a hunter's camp. Now, some would call it a poacher's camp. We greeted the men, but their response was hesitant, and I sensed a guardedness on their part and an unease on the part of Elias. They started a conversation with him, and I had the opportunity to look them over more closely. The wanted-to-run character was the youngest, and he still seemed a bit homesick, but he was anxious to live down his almost-ran reaction. Those types are usually the most unpredictable, I thought briefly to myself. Of the other 2, one seemed like an affable, harmless sort when he was by himself or in different company, but the other one had a very dark complexion, and he had heavy eyelids, and he was staring at me somewhat insolently, and, I noticed, taking the lead and being quite assertive in his manner. He also showed a special interest in my rifle. Interactions with Africans are usually friendly and relaxed, but the atmosphere here was nervous, even a bit hostile. We were in a very remote place, where there were no laws but the honor of men, and right then we were in the company of men who lived by a harsh code and regarded my high-powered rifle as probably the greatest possible prize they could win in their entire life, the means to much easier hunting and a source of great status. I suddenly realized that both Elias and my life wasn't worth much more than the risk of injury to them, and that they knew we would be almost completely untraceable if we should simply disappear here. From the signs around us, it seemed as if the camp was being used by at least 15 people. Some would be armed, most likely with an automatic weapon or two that had spilled over from the war situation. All of this flashed through my mind, but I had to keep my pose. I fixed a cold stare on heavy eyelids, and I casually but deliberately swung the 404 from my shoulder and slipped off the safety. At the same time, I discreetly retreated with my back towards the tree and the muzzleloader. We were half lucky to have found only the three at home. Elias was talking to them, and I noticed him gesturing vaguely to the west. By this time, I'd moved back so that I had some distance between myself and the men, my back against the baobab. I casually sat down on my haunches, rifle resting across my legs. I was heartened to see that my unyielding attitude seemed to have caused some uncertainty in them, and especially in heavy eyelids, who had now averted his gaze. But I knew the situation could turn against us very quickly if some of their armed colleagues arrived back. So when Elias looked back at me, I gestured with my head that we should leave, and I put on an area of bored irritation. I wanted to exploit their temporary uncertainty to make a clean breakaway, and leave them sufficiently unsure to not consider following us, even if some of their companions returned. Their type was usually cowardly, or perhaps sensible. They were unlikely to take on something they were not convinced they had a good chance of overpowering without too much resistance. But I remained concerned about them trying to follow us as soon as their numbers and firepower gave them sufficient confidence. They would certainly have the tracking capability to do it. I was hoping that the three would paint a fairly ferocious picture of us to their companions, and that they would be further discouraged by the uncertainty of whether we had any companions and how far they might be away. When I thought we were out of their sight, I quickened the pace, keeping west. After about 30 minutes, we got to a rocky area where it would be extremely difficult to follow our spoor. I crossed over it, keeping west, but then, after about a kilometer, I doubled back in a wide loop, coaxing Elias into leaving as little sign as possible. When we got back to the rocky area, I stopped and explained to Elias in sign language that he should move back some distance to see if someone wasn't trying to follow us. He understood immediately and cleverly took a route some way off our path. When he got back, shaking his head at my inquiring glance, I swung sharply south, seeking out the hard ground for some distance before I gestured to Elias to take the lead back to our campsite. I was applying classic anti-tracking measures. If they were reasonably good trackers, they could pick up our tracks on the western side of the rocky area and continue west with them. And hopefully, when they disappeared, where we doubled back, they would give up. If they were real master trackers, they might still be able to figure it out, especially if they knew something of anti-tracking. But we could only now hope for the best. I felt a bit silly taking all these precautions, but on the other hand, it would be extremely unpleasant if we received visits from them in the dead of the night. Companions, that was another story about my encounters with poachers in the wilderness, this time about the killer gangs. So next time I'll tell you about the last category of poachers. I hope you will join me again. Good luck.